want to tell you a little bit about myself. I think first, I started out here in Scottsdale in 1970. Oh my, actually I was living here since 1973. But in the mid to late 70s, I started a printing and publishing company in Scottsdale, right downtown. And that kind of grew into the study, ultimately, of globalization. Who's ever heard of globalization before? You know the term. Who likes globalization? Away with you, no. Everybody has a sense that something's wrong with this globalization process, because in Arizona's case, it's not about Arizona, it's about them, what they want to come in from outside the state and tell us what to do. And that's probably the biggest problem with globalization. But I saw that, unfortunately, way back in those early days, that globalization was going to be the big problem of the future. And I teamed up with a professor who had just been excommunicated from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And we both were on the same track, research-wise at the time, and we teamed up to begin to write about an organization that back then, it still is actually, called the Trilateral Commission. And this produced ultimately these 2 volumes of Trilaterals over Washington. And it delineated how the early globalist movement was intending to subvert America into something other than what America is, right? And unfortunately, even though we spoke to, oh gosh, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people probably back then, nobody really listened and paid attention. The people in universities and some other, political types, they kind of understood it, they nod their head, oh yeah, we get it, we see what's all behind this. And then they go off and do nothing, and nothing happened. And so my writing partner is now since dead. He died in 2002. But if he were here today, he was a man of few words. He was a Brit, actually. And if he was here today, he would have the shortest talk in the whole world. And basically, he would just say, I told you so. and then he'd sit down and say, if you want any more, you go read his work. But we left, we got married to Charmaine in 82, and 81, and then we left in 89, 8 years later. Our kids were born here, sons, and we left and went up to Northern California, where I completed my family responsibilities, not only to raise children, but to take care of my grandmother and my mother at that time, and they both ultimately passed. And so we migrated up to North Idaho from there, thinking that would be a nice place to stay, and it was. Lots of snow. Scottsdale, boy, probably had fun in the snow for a few years, but we finally decided we're out of here. So we came back to Arizona ultimately. This was our homes where we started, and I went to college at University of Arizona, so Arizona's kind of been in my blood for a very long time. So having said all that, just to tell you how we got here, about 10 years ago, I ran across a historic topic that interested me, and it was called Technocracy. Anybody heard the word Technocracy before? Okay, or how about Technocrat? Have you heard the word Technocrat referring to individuals? Okay. Technocracy was a historical movement that started in the 1930s, and I was almost ashamed in the end of the search, because I thought I knew something about American history. Going to the University of Arizona, by the way, wasn't what you call a stimulating educational endeavor. It was kind of the party school of the 70s. And, I'm not sure anybody really learned a whole lot there. I didn't. But nevertheless, I thought I knew something about American history, and this thing blindsided me. I'd never heard of it before. And so I was curious, and I started searching it because of my economic and financial background. And I very quickly discovered that there was a nexus, there was a coming together of this technocracy philosophy with globalization that was being expressed in the early 1970s. Okay, if you want to ask a question along the way, just raise your hand. We're informal here. That I found that they dovetail together. And it's a long story, and I don't want to bore you with the whole thing, but when the Trilateral Commission was started, there were two names, the two co-founders will ring a bell with you, I'm sure, immediately. The first one was David Rockefeller, the big money bags of the century. And he was looking for ways to promote globalization. He didn't have it necessarily before 1973 when they started this Trilateral Commission. But the other co-founder was a very brilliant political scientist by the name of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Anybody ever heard of him before? Well, okay, Brzezinski was an academic. He was from Columbia University, and he teamed up with Rockefeller as an ideologue, if you will, to Rockefeller money, and the two of them set off to launch modern globalization, which we see expressed initially in the Trilateral Commission and now in Technocracy. Rockefeller was the Rockefeller family and other big-time families of the world like that at the time were interested in accumulating more wealth for themselves. There was no such thing as enough. They always wanted a little bit more. And so there came a point when they realized that the financial system ultimately, mathematically, had to fail someday. We're almost to that point now. They saw that back then, that there was big trouble with the financial system, and they made a decision, generally, to go after the resources directly. Instead of going after the money, going after the resources. Those of you who have any connection to land, farms, ranching, and so on, know that all wealth of the world comes from the land. Everything. You've got timber, you've got oil, you've got metals and minerals, and you know, everything. All wealth eventually, or not eventually, originally starts with the land. And so the movement in those early days was to figure out some way to get control of resources rather than just the money, because it makes sense. Think about it. If you have control of the resources, does it matter what type of monetary system is in place? Well, no, it doesn't. Because everything coming from the land has to be given to the people who are alive at that time to live and to you know, do business or whatever. So this is what they set out to do initially. This has come full circle now, and I kind of want to fast forward a little bit through this. This came full circle when the Trilateral Commission, as this group of globalists, fed this whole doctrine to the United Nations. And they did so in order to provide a contagion, to spread their ideology to the rest of the world and get the whole world on the same page. This was the goal from the beginning, was to create a global system, if you will, not necessarily a political management. A lot of people look at the UN and say, oh, that's global government, I don't want that. Well, it's, you know, you can kind of say that, but it really wasn't. It was about money, it was about economics, it wasn't just about politics. So the United Nations took this idea of this new international economic order, as they called it in the early days of the Commission, and they took it to the United Nations and fed it to the UN, hook, line, and sinker. The UN picked up on it because Rockefeller family had a very tight connection with the UN. In fact, they had originally given the land to the United Nations upon which the UN building sits today. So they're very tight. And the United Nations took after a process from '73 through the late '80s of refining the philosophy of economic activity in the world. Where it ended up, and you know, being called, they kind of changed some of the names and stuff, but it became known ultimately as what they call today sustainable development. Who's heard of sustainable development?
Yes, okay. Give us some of the other names.
Well, some of the other names, we'll see, Agenda 21, green capitalism, Green New Deal. You've all heard that in the news recently.
Smart cities.
This is all from different. This is all kind of out of the same mold. And technocracy and sustainable development, as I documented in one of my first book, Technocracy Rising, is substantially equivalent to sustainable development. They're the same. They're interchangeable terms. It's not surprising that the marketing-minded people who are trying to deceive and manipulate the public would change the names of things along the way. They do that all the time. So what started out as technocracy became sustainable development. Sustainable development, then the name pops out of the woodwork in 1992 called Agenda 21. Anybody heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
Agenda 21, okay.
2030.
Agenda 21 was not a term that Americans liked, straight off. Whatever it was, the Americans didn't want anything to do with it. And so they changed the name again. And they changed it. We have this on tape from Congress, actually. It's amazing. They changed the name for marketing this whole program to the United States, and they called it Smart Growth. Yeah. Have you ever heard of Smart Growth? Okay, now this is something that's real prevalent in development circles and community development circles and so on. Smart growth, smart cities, bringing all the technology in to control, surveil and all that kind of stuff. This is all part of smart growth. It's all part of sustainable development. It's changed the name. So when trying to understand today what's going on with, the United Nations, the economic system of the world, and so on, it's important to understand the different threads of history that came together to produce it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I mean, it's not that complicated. You don't have to be, professor of history or anything to understand this. It's like these forces have been moving for a very long time, since at least the 1930s. When technocracy was originally started, it was at Columbia University in New York City. Anybody heard of Columbia University? I hope all of you have. But some people say not much good ever came out of Columbia University. And probably would share that to some extent, although I'm sure there's exceptions. But Columbia at the time, in the Great Depression, 1932, there was a lot of grief in America, unemployment, soup line, bread lines, people were desperate, jumping out of windows, stuff like that. And it was a horrible time. People were really upset with the politicians back in those days. Kind of like we are today. They thought that they're all a bunch of idiots. They got us into this mess, and look what we got now. It's a train wreck, and what are we going to do to get out of it? Well, these engineers and scientists at Columbia University got this brainiac idea that they could create a brand new economic system that would replace capitalism and free enterprise, because they figured those are dead. The Depression, man, it's gone, done. So they decided to model this brand new economic system, engineering, from an engineering perspective. They called it technocracy. And it was managed everything. They wanted to control in fact, they called it the science of social engineering. They wanted to focus and manage society, sort of like a herd of cattle, if you will, and take care of people's economic needs. And they wanted to propose a brand new monetary system that was based on energy, not currency. And I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but basically it was a resource-based economic system. It was based on resource allocation and resource distribution. So they would control all the resources. And they wanted to distribute the resources as it was appropriate to all the people in society. And so they said there was no need for private resources, that nobody should own anything. Why would you want to own anything? We'd take care of everything, take care of all your needs. And they would say that there's no need for any kind of private property related, whether it be real estate or maybe the clothes on your back, but that's about it. And they wanted to kind of set up this utopian type system where everybody would work maybe 20 hours a week, and you'd get your little energy script to buy stuff, and there would be no way to save money because there was no savings. You simply would just live month to month and quarter to quarter by what they would give you from the top down. That was the technocracy system. And you could read about this in history now. There's enough of it. I brought a lot of it forward, a lot of original research, and you can study what happened back there in the 1930s. By the time World War II was done, technocracy had completely faded by and large in the public's mind. But during that time, between 32 to the early 40s, technocracy was a major movement in America, especially in North America and Canada as well. There were over 500,000 card-carrying members of the technocracy group in America. And these were people that paid dues, that went to meetings, that you know, stimulated the thought, pushed it along, and, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And they made it a big thing. In fact, in Canada, it was so big that the Canadian government made an association between the Technocracy movement up there and the Nazi movement in Germany at the time. It was partly because of the way they were dressed. They had these gray suits with blue tie and a double-breasted suit. Everybody wore the same suit. That's kind of their uniform, right? And the women had skirts that were matching. They had the three-piece, but it was a skirt. And they all looked like little robots, sort of, you know, when they would walk around, they're all wearing this gray. And they even had Technocracy gray cars, automobiles. You could go down to Ford or Chevy and order. Say, I want a Technocracy gray car. Oh, yes, sir. You know, we'll have it for you in 3 weeks or whatever. In Canada, they got a little nervous about that, thinking this looks suspiciously like what was going on in Germany at the time with the SS and, you know, the Secret Service they had over there. And they banned the Technocracy movement in Canada for 2 years. Just said, no more, you're done. And they shut them down. And they finally got reinstated after a time when, you know, they finally figured, I guess, it didn't have anything directly to do with Nazi Germany. But they were convinced at the time that it did. A sidebar on that is the Grand Poobah who ran the Technocracy movement in Canada, his name was Joshua Haldeman, and he was the director of the whole thing. There was 4 provinces, and then you had, each province had its own head, and he was the guy over all of Canada, right? I won't say president, I say Grand Poobah, who knows? But he was the head guy. Just so happens that he's a technocrat, dyed in the wool, thoroughly bought into the whole scientific engineering of all society. He happened to be the grandfather of somebody all of you know today, Elon Musk. And Elon Musk, who of course runs Tesla and SpaceX and Boring Company and who knows how many other companies, great technology, you know, the guy seems to be a genius and everything, but the guy was raised in a household of technocrats pushing technocracy. You can see that flavor coming through in his operations today in the world. You can also see it with some of his cronies as well. If you look at some other big tech titans today, like the Peter Thiels and the Eric Schmidts and you know, the Twitters and Jeff Bezos and so on, you can see this ideology, this philosophy of wanting to manage society through scientific engineering. My guess is anybody in this room would probably say, you ain't going to manage me. This is America. I'll do what I want to do, and I want, you know, government to just get off my back, and I want the free agency to decide where I want to live, where I want to go, what I want to do, work, etc. And I don't want to be told that I can't do a certain thing. Well, okay, enough of that. That Elon Musk was a freebie. Fast forward to 1992. Well, maybe we're going backwards to 1992. When Agenda 21 came into play in 1992, it was because of a conference that the United Nations held in Rio de Janeiro. Has anybody ever heard of that before? The First Earth Conference Summit, they call it? Yeah. Well, this is where all the nations of the world come together. There were tens of thousands of people. They all come together. They have meetings, they have plenary sessions, and they have workshops, and they hammer out the details of these global treaties that they want to have. And so happened, Agenda 21 was called the Agenda for the 21st Century. And it had all this resource-based economic nonsense in it. And just to kind of back up just a little bit to show you where it came from, there was a commission that the United Nations launched in 1983, it ran until 1987, and it produced a book called Our Common Future. And you can buy this book still, it's on Amazon, and used bookstores, you can buy it. And Our Common Future became the doctrinal book that produced Agenda 21 in 1992. The United Nations themselves write extensively about this. It was this book that provided the doctrine of sustainable development through which Agenda 21 was produced. It just so happened that the head of that commission, it's called the Brundtland Commission, was a lady by the name of Gru Harlem Brundtland, and you've probably never heard of her before, but she was from Europe, and she was also one of the early members of the Trilateral Commission. And I contend in my books that the doctrine she gave to the United Nations for Sustainable Development was straight out of the bowels of policy from the Trilateral Commission itself. In other words, she wasn't writing on her own behalf, she was writing on behalf of the group that sponsored her to get there in the first place, and that was the Trilateral Commission. So this doctrine, as it moved into the Trilateral Commission, we can trace it back to this globalization group, the Trilateral Commission. The United Nations took it then, got all the nations of the world to sign on to it. Say, oh, this is great, you know, we love it. We're all going to do this. We're going to have one big happy family, and everybody's going to be great together, and we're going to tell you all what to do, and you know, some people thought, you know, really bought into it. Other people thought, nah, I don't know about that, you know. Well, I have a book in my hand here called The Earth Brokers, and this is a book that was written in 1994 by two of the participants that were involved in all of the Agenda 21 conference. They were there as participants. These guys were some of the original Greens. I call them Greens, the environmentalists, right? They were before 1990 type of green. They were more of the ideological Greens, not the nutcake wackos you see chaining themselves to trees today, but they were more of the people that were really concerned about the environment back in those days. And so they were glad to participate in the Agenda 21 conference. They were part of the United Nations at the time, and they did. And they came away as skeptics. And they ended up writing this book in '94 because they were so concerned. One of these guys was an assistant professor at the New School in New York City, which is a thoroughly progressive university. The other one, I can't remember where he's from, Pradip Chatterjee, I think he was from California. But they wrote this book, and in this book, this is their main premise from the introduction. Throughout this book, we show how UNCED, that UNCED, I'm going to use that term, it's called United Nations Conference on Economic Development, okay, UNCED. It doesn't mean it's unset. It's just, I'm going to call it UNCED, right? Throughout this book, we show how UNCED has promoted business and industry, rehabilitated nation states as relevant agents, and eroded the green movement. We argue that UNCED has boosted precisely the type of industrial development that is destructive for the environment, the planet, and its inhabitants. We see how, as a result of UNCED, the rich will get richer, the poor poorer, while more and more of the planet is destroyed in the process. Now, these were guys who were considered experts at the time. I don't know if they're still alive, they might be. But they produced this entire book to document their case that the policies that were put in play during the Agenda 21 conference, if allowed to play out, would end up destroying the world rather than helping it. And looking at 2020, you look at it, have we healed the world, or have we destroyed the world in the last, are we better off now than we were then, or are things really slipping away? Well, you can't hardly say. We've gotten a whole lot better. One of the United Nations goals, for instance, was to eliminate poverty everywhere. Oh, who doesn't want to eliminate poverty? It's a great goal, but have they eliminated poverty? No, just the contrary. This whole pandemic thing, as it's come along now, which we're going to talk about, this whole pandemic thing has come along, and it has driven at least 200 million people in the world into extreme poverty. In addition to what was there already. That means they get less than $2 a day to survive. That's not very good living. So all of their altruistic goals that they put out to eliminate poverty and jobs for everybody, and it's going to be wonderful, whatever, all these wonderful goals of utopia have turned brown, they've turned to sawdust, and they have no hope of ever achieving these goals that they put out. But the details on all this Agenda 21 stuff, the details are down at the bottom of the documents that they produce. They have the vision of utopia to hook everybody in. And down below, the price tag is put on it. And the price tag is very simple. Turn over all your resources to us and let us manage the resources. That's all. Just let us manage the resources and you'll be fine. We know what's best for you. We know if you're a businessman, we'll tell you what you're allowed to make. And if you're a consumer, we'll tell you what you're allowed to consume. What could be wrong with that? Well, it's not the American way, for sure. And a lot of people in the world are reacting against that right now, right? So these people back then had it absolutely nailed. But I ran across something as I highlight everything. I use these wild markers, you know, just to remind me of what I like. And I reviewed the highlights the other day, just sitting doing nothing, and something really caught my eye. Never saw this before. Never saw this before. But I'm going to read you one of their conclusions here and see if you can, you know, we'll fast forward now a little bit into what I call the Great Panic of 2020. That is the pandemic that we're dealing with today. They said on, what is it, page 43, to recap, the main stake raised by the Biodiversity Convention, that was 1992, is the issue of ownership and control. Okay, so I already talked about that. Ownership and control over, now listen to this, biological diversity. Have you ever heard the term biological diversity? How about just diversity? Hear that in the news occasionally today. So they say the issue of ownership and control had to do with biological diversity. In other words, they wanted to control biological diversity. Now, we've had a lot of biological diversity in the world. There's species of weeds and grass and trees and animals, and it's a wonderful thing, right? You go out into the woods or whatever, or the zoo, you see all these different animals. It's amazing to see the diversity that's in the world. These people, and just remember now, all the diversity species in the world are assets, they're resources, right, that have the connection to the land. I'll read this again. The main stake raised by the Biodiversity Convention is the issue of ownership and control over biological diversity. In the case of the North, that would be us, and the USA in particular, the major concern, this is back in 1982, the major concern was protecting the pharmaceutical and emerging biotechnology industries which get their raw material from the forests. I read that again and said, holy mackerel. Way back here in 1992, they're talking about the pharmaceutical and the emerging biotechnology industries. And what struck me, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, what struck me now is that these scientific brainiacs had in mind to get a hold and take control over biological diversity in the world. In other words, who was going to be in charge of creating new species and doing new things with genetic engineering and stuff like that with the biotechnology companies, industry? They wanted control over biological diversity as well as control over the land. It was just another resource to them. And the target was set back here in 1992. The fact that these two people, who had nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry, they recognized by the lobbying that was going on in these meetings, these were the guys that were circulating around trying to get control of the narrative. And this is basically where, by the way, that all this intellectual property talk started, with patenting GMO seeds and GMO animals, and now GMO humans. It's kind of a scary thing to think. But the people who are in charge now of genetic modification throughout the world, most of those are in universities, but some in pharmaceutical companies and some in other biotech companies. These people now are applying their science to literally try to change humanity into something that humanity was not beforehand. This is really kind of nutsy, I have to say. One more quote out of this book, and I'll put it down. At the end of the book, he says, neither Bruntland, that was our common future lady, neither Bruntland nor the Secretariat nor the government drafted plans to examine the pitfalls of free trade and industrial development. Instead, they wrote up a convention on how to develop the use of biodiversity through patents and biotechnology. Can I read it again? I think I should. Neither Bruntland nor the Secretariat nor the government's drafted plans to examine the pitfalls of free trade and industrial development. That's what they would have liked to have done. I would have liked to have done the same thing. Instead, they wrote up a convention, that's Agenda 21, on how to, quote unquote, develop the use of biodiversity through patents and biotechnology. That is exactly where we find ourselves today. It's exactly where we find ourselves. Is that, you have a question?
So that's like the Monsanto and all those people get involved in the genetically modified, I've just read a little bit about like the Monsanto, like the people that created Asian orange and then they now are like creating seeds and all of that, and people suspect, I mean, that's the whole Roundup thing, right? They were cancer, came from them.
Right.
Were they a part of that whole, is that when this all started?
Absolutely, they were. And that's the biggest problem with the whole thing. They were planning this from the very get-go. Even I did not recognize this when I did my studies, the original studies on technocracy. I never saw that. I highlighted it, but I guess it never connected. Now we have reason, with the great pandemic that's happening today, we have reason to revisit that just a little bit. I want to sidestep just for a bit and show you another book that was written by an author by the name of Wesley J. Smith. This is a more modern book. And he's with the Discovery Institute up in Seattle, the Center for Science and Culture. He's really a great writer, I have to say. He's really plugged into this. But he wrote a book called The War on Humans. And I merely want to bring this out to mention that he makes a really good case that this whole movement that I'm talking about is basically a war on humanity, and that it's fundamentally anti-human. And if you can think through some news stories you might have heard in the last, say, 3 or 4 months, you have groups in Europe, for instance, called, one group called the Extinction Rebellion. Anybody ever heard of that and seen that in the news story? We can search on that. Extinction Rebellion. These people are promoting the extinction of humanity. And you say, how can that happen? One professor in Great Britain wrote a book that expressed the final solution on how to save the world. How to preserve the world.
All the people, it would be great, huh?
And she said, we just need to let the human race go extinct.
Oh my God.
A professor. It's like, how can somebody come to that conclusion that the best thing for planet Earth is to let the human race go extinct? It doesn't make any sense. But the more you dig into this whole philosophy, you see how anti-human it really is. I don't know how anybody could not like people because they are one. Right? It's like if you love yourself, at least, you have some respect for other people too. These people apparently don't. Many of them don't. So we see this philosophy that's kind of running through this whole thing that is anti-human and anti-humanity. And having done all the research from the 30s on, reading their original documents and stuff, I've got one such thing in my hand here, reading their original documents, you can see where they got this from, how they got this original idea started, that humanity was something that was that needed to be managed and controlled, no different than the cattle in the feedlot. Basically, it's just a project. It's just an engineering project. And if you've ever seen a feedlot,
And Patrick, do you feel like that's part of what Bill Gates is?
Absolutely.
That's the agenda.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you get, if you've ever seen a feedlot, the cattle get shoved from one pen to the other. They get shot with needles, and they get their special rations mixed up, and they take it out in trucks, and they like this. They put it out there for the cattle to eat, and they eat, and they get monitored. They're tagged, and they have sensors in them to tell when they're sick and they need some kind of attention or whatever. It's very scientific today, and you say, wow, that's engineering has taken over the feedlot industry. Well, yes, it has, but what if that same kind of mentality all of a sudden is now focused on humans, you see? And it has been. And that's where these people, that's where their minds are set, yes.
Do you see the connection that they try to give hormones to children at school, in a young age? And then, yes.
Hormones.
And then with the transgender, things, do you link that together? I could.
Yep.
Yeah, and let's make the distinction that we're not anti-science, we're not anti-engineering, any of that.
I love science personally. I love engineering. I am one. I love the technical stuff. And I'm convinced 95% of all the engineers and scientists in the world are great people that have no desire to control the world. None whatsoever. But it's the 5% over here that are just off the rails, and they think somehow they're God's, well, they don't believe in God, but God's gift to mankind, that they have the right to rule over everybody else with the scientific method. And that's what they're trying to do. So I brought this old book with me. It was published in, oh gosh, when was it published? I want to probably say 1934. Oh, 1933, New York and London. It's called The ABC of Technocracy by a guy named Frank Arkwright. And the only reason I just bring this is to show you what they put on the front cover. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm going to tell you. It has 3 things crossed out up here, and it has technocracy at the bottom of it. This is his case. He crossed out capitalism. Capitalism was dead. He crossed out socialism, because they believed socialism was just completely dead too as an ideology, and he crossed out communism, and he ended up with technocracy. This would be hard, I don't want to argue with anybody on this, this would be hard for you to accept if you have been kind of conditioned to think that all of our problems today are based on communism and socialism and Marxism. That's a problem. I'm not saying it's not a problem, but these people that operate on this level, these technocrats, are not communists, they're not socialists, and they're not capitalists. There's something different, and there's something very different about them. And you need to, your goal would be to discover what is different about them that you don't like, or that would be worth getting alarmed over. Okay? So, I've been alarmed about socialism and communism most all of my life too. I've just admit it. But when you get right down to the bottom of it, it's these people that are pulling the strings. Now let me tell you how. A little bit. Back in the early part of the year, put your mind over in Great Britain. There was a professor at Imperial College of London by the name of Neil Ferguson. Anybody ever heard his name?
He started this.
You need to. Neil Ferguson. He was like I said, a professor, a doctor, a PhD. He was an epidemiologist. That is not a doctor. They have no medical training. Epidemiologist is a statistician. So they wouldn't know one end of a stethoscope from another, basically, any more than you and I would. And he was part of a university that was much like ASU, in the sense that it was a university dedicated to social impact, not to education, not to excellence in education. And so they measured the success of the school on what kind of social impact they could have in the world. And as a result, they were very much in line and tied into the United Nations with sustainable development, and in particular global warming. And they were one of the university clique in Europe that produced all of these computer models showing how the world is going to melt down because of global warming, and that we're all going to die. Remember when Al Gore said this a few years ago? He said, we're all, the ice caps are going to be melted in 12 years. And the seas are going to rise, and New York's going to be underwater. Well, did that happen? No. The ice caps didn't melt. And so, these predictions have come out for years trying to create fear in the population to do something. And what is that something that global warming was trying to do? Because remember, it was coming mostly from the United Nations, right? Remember the Paris Accord? That was all about global warming. That was the United Nations operation. The whole goal of the global warming mantra, with all their studies, their crackpot science, it's been discredited 6 ways to Sunday since. It's still out there, and people still believe it, but it's been discredited. The science pseudoscience of global warming was to drive people into sustainable development. There was never, ever another alternative presented. There's no plan B. They said the only thing to do is you have to accept sustainable development. And the sooner you do, the sooner we can take care of global warming. Because global warming is going to kill us all if we don't do something about it in this generation. And so the panic went on and on and on, year after year, and finally a poor little teenage girl by the name of Greta Thunberg went to the United Nations and scolded them. Shame on you, your house is on fire, and you're doing nothing about it. And she tried to shame them into some kind of action. That was all theater, by the way, pure theater. But the youth movement that came out of that tried to get all the governments in the world, the tears for the young people, you're destroying our generation, yada, yada, whatever. We must accept sustainable development or we're all going to die. This whole global movement just collapsed at the end of last year. Greta couldn't get any more mileage than she got. That was a pinnacle at the United Nations. She ran out of steam. The youth movement ran out of steam. The adult movement ran out of steam. And basically all of the studies that were produced by these highfalutin scientists like Neil Ferguson with these faulty computer models, they were out of work, basically. They were just sitting there. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'd like to add a comment that I think a lot of people are not aware of. Just having been related to the media industry, one of my colleagues, informed me that he had moved from his small PR agency into the largest PR agency in the world called Havas. And he said, guess who my biggest client is right now? And he said it was the United Nations. Meaning they have the biggest budget that outspent Coca-Cola and the big massive budgets that you think in order to get their stories out. And so I just wanted to kind of say that because it's everywhere around you, wherever you look, every types of,
And they're paying for it.
and they're paying for it with real dollars, because that's a PR agency bought, and PR agencies essentially create news stories, they put them out on the wire, and different news outlets and all sorts of different sources just pick them up. They're pre-written stories that you can just pluck up. You put a talking head on it, they change it a little bit, but they essentially say the same story over and over again. So it's kind of pre-packaged media for you.
Yeah, good point. Well, when Neil Ferguson first published his study from his computer model, he was a guy that stated that 1.2 million Americans were going to die, and that 500,000 Brits were going to die in short order because of COVID.
Yeah.
And he blew the whistle, if you will. He blew the whistle in such a way that the United Nations, or I'm sure they were just waiting in the sidelines to receive this, the United Nations took his dog whistle, if you will, and they took it and they spread it via the World Health Organization to every other nation on earth. And I know you're going to ask, well, how could they do that? What the UN has done over a period of years is create treaties with individual nations in the world. And some of them are economic treaties, some of them have to do with health, some of them have to do with other things, but they create these treaties. And so the World Health Organization had agreements with most of the nations in the world to do whatever it was they said to do. If an emergency came along and said, we're going to be in charge, whatever, and you need to do this. Well, the UN immediately applied all of those treaties. They brought them to the surface. They said, okay, guys, this is the real deal. And this is what you need to do. Boom. And they threw it out to the whole world at the same time, that we have this massive pandemic, and that this is how you need to respond. Now, Neil Ferguson, back to him, his computer model was completely discredited within, I think, 4 months of the time he actually produced this. He finally released the actual underlying computer code to the community of computer science to analyze. And they analyzed it and said, this is a piece of junk unfit for scientific use. That was a professional, observation. He also got into personal trouble too. He didn't obey his own policies, whatever, and he was having an affair with somebody in a very strange, open relationship over there. Very, very odd. He's Great Britain. But he kind of got tanked removed from the scene. But the policies that he set out when he first blew the whistle on 1.2 million Americans are going to die, 500,000 Brits, he also released the policies that needed to be implemented in order to curtail all those deaths, right? So he had the fear-mongering thing on one hand, and he had, this is what you need to do. If you want to save yourselves, this is what you need to do. This guy's not a doctor. He's not, we have no evidence that he was associating with doctors either. But here's what he said. Close down all the schools. Socially distance. Wear masks. Oh, isn't that what's happening today? Yes. This didn't come from any medical community. This came from a pedestrian epidemiologist that had formerly been associated with global warming computer models that were completely cracked as well, trying to foist something new on the world. And so what's the answer then? If we have a pandemic, what's the answer? It's absolutely amazing. What the World Economic Forum is now calling the Great Reset. And if you go and look at the World Economic Forum's website, you'll see it's all about the United Nations, it's all about sustainable development, it's all about the 17 sustainable development goals, and it's all about getting rid of capitalism and killing off capitalism and free enterprise altogether, taking away property rights, taking away the wealth, rights to any wealth. And you look at that and say, gee, this looks suspiciously like the global warming argument. They're only offering one solution, and it's sustainable development. That's what you need to do. They don't offer anything, well, let's fix capitalism, or let's, maybe we'll do some other form. No, it's only sustainable development. They're what you call a one-trick pony. That's all they got to offer. So everything on the fear-mongering that's happening here is designed to drive people into sustainable development, aka technocracy. A resource-based economic system where they own and control the resources and you and I don't. We simply will become subjects to them in the end, where we will get our allocation according to how they decide we should be allocated. Well, you live on a beautiful golf course here. One of the things, I should have brought my big book, the biodiversity manual. It's this thick, 1,200 pages. This thing weighs about 20 pounds. I should have brought it, but it tells us what is unsustainable and what is sustainable. One of the things on the list is golf courses. Golf courses are unsustainable. Too much water, too much grass, you see? And so we need to do away with golf courses. And what about ranching? Oh, ranching is bad. Cattle are bad. Got to get rid of the cattle. Why, they flatulate. And they create methane and CO2 and whatever, and they're a scourge to the land because it's inefficient use of land, and they're tearing down forests in order for the cattle to take over. So cattle industry is unsustainable. How about agriculture? That's unsustainable too, they say. They need to have some different kind of agriculture, like stack them and pack them and grow them horizontally or vertically in the cities or something. But this list goes on of unsustainable stuff. And you look at it and you say, are you crazy? If you did all this, we'd have no life. We would have no life as humans. We wouldn't be sitting here in this beautiful place, this beautiful town, and weather, whatever. I don't know what we would be doing. But it would be
Staying in our houses wearing masks.
pretty dystopian. Sounds like we're all wearing masks.
We're not, yes, this is our
But
house.
You have 5 families over there.
But single-family homes are unsustainable too. Uses too much energy.
I'm sorry.
I just said single-family homes are unsustainable too because it uses too much energy.
That's right. Single-family homes, forget that.
They don't become multi-family homes.
They're very wasteful.
Yeah.
And, we need to have, what they call smart growth type of units where you have the retail on the bottom and the, people living on top of it, right? How'd you like to live, above a Thai restaurant, or a Chinese restaurant? You're going to smell Chinese food all day long. But that's part of the fun, guys. Get used to it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you forgot light rail.
Pardon?
You forgot light rail.
Light rail is on the market because automobiles are not sustainable.
Right.
Automobiles are considered, of course, fossil fuels in general are considered evil. And the entire idea that you should own an individual car that sits in your driveway for 90% of the, 95% of the time is unsustainable because it's a waste of resources, and shame on you.
Where
You should
does,
be using ride share, or you should be using the light rail, or you should be using buses, or Uber, or some other scheme where you have ride sharing. But let me tell you about ride sharing. I just flashed on it. Back in 1932, in the Technocracy study course, which I couldn't find to bring, I wanted to. This was their Bible. They had planned to implement a national transportation agency where they were going to put warehouses around the country in all the major metro areas where cars would be delivered to, and any citizen could go and check out a car here, like say in Phoenix, drive it to Los Angeles, check it into the, to the place over there, and they would simply pay the mileage fee to get from here to here. In their mind, this was the most wonderful plan to solve the, transportation in the whole world, and they would have pickup trucks and they would have other types of transportation too, but basically you just get a little car and zoom off and go, and then you check it in, and that would be it. And you didn't need to own a car. That was a waste of resources. Well, gee, that's exactly what they're saying today. In many cities around the world, and including in the United States, we need to get rid of cars, get cars off the streets. We need to get people on bicycles. We need to get people on the buses and the rail system or whatever, and get them out of their cars. I was tickled when Portland, crazy Portland, just makes you like wink, When Portland, and this was, I want to say, May, maybe April, May. Portland, which already is steeped in sustainable development from top to bottom. They're just absolutely insane city. And I hope some of you aren't from Portland here. I sort of got myself in trouble. But Portland, in order to save resources in Portland, during the pandemic, decided to close down to automobiles 200 miles of city streets. 200 miles. And they simply just put up concrete barriers and said, no cars on this street anymore. And some of the streets maybe didn't matter, but some of them were, used by locals and stuff all the time. And he says, too bad, they're shut down. And so there's pictures all of a sudden emerge of people riding with bicycles, like maybe, every few feet there's somebody else on a bicycle. They're riding down this empty street, no cars. And who knows if they're going anywhere. It might have been all staged for all I know. But it's like you see this. In San Francisco, they're closing down Market Street. If you've ever been to San Francisco, that's the main drag through. And you know how screwball all of the streets come into Market Street at little angles and stuff? If you can't get on Market Street, you ain't getting out of downtown. That's the only way. Well, they've decided that they need to shut down Market Street and make it pedestrian only, and for bicycles and scooters, these little electric scooters and stuff. Well, this has happened in Seattle, it's happening in other cities around the country and around the world. This is all part of this, you got me started on this with light rail. This is all part of this thing, the sustainable development mantra about what is sustainable. And automobiles are not sustainable, so that's what they want to get rid of. Yes, sir.
Oh, well, I had two things. One thing I wanted to point out, that there's two people in council, that one of them's gone, thank God, and the other one will be gone in 2 years. They tried to shut down downtown. They wanted to do the same thing, no cars allowed in downtown.
In 1998, let's say, 1999. There was a time when ASU was judged by its scholastic merit, and the students it produced that went out into the world, whatever, and did important things, right? It was maybe not top in the country, but it was a pretty decent academic institution back then. When Michael Crow came in, was it 2001 or 2, as the head of ASU, do you realize where he came from? Number one, Columbia University. Yeah, the same place where Technocracy was born. But that aside, when he came out here to ASU, he had a vision in his mind to change the university into measuring its success based on social impact and how much it could impact society around it. That's altogether different than educational scholarship, you understand? It's a different animal. You go to engineering school to learn engineering. You want to come out being a good engineer, right? And so you want to know all the formulas and how to do everything, whatever. You shouldn't be pumped full of propaganda
Right.
on pushing sustainable development and how to build light rail systems or whatever. I mean, just learn your discipline and get out. Crow has changed the whole culture. He speaks about this very openly too. That ASU is now measured based on its success is measured on social impact in the community and also around the world. And he's spread his influence way outside of Arizona at this point. They have more students online, I think 250,000 students or something like that online from around the world that are taking classes from ASU, all based on social impact stuff. So recently, early last year, ASU created a consortium for building smart regions in our area. They were the first university to do this. And they created a nonprofit organization that sat alongside of ASU, nonprofit being like 501c3 nonprofit. And they also partnered with the Greater Phoenix Economic Board, whatever it used to be, they call it Phoenix 40, but it's the big mucky mucks in Phoenix. Also an NGO. And they created this consortium to develop smart city policies. That would be surveillance, that would be
5G.
sensors, that would be the fancy light poles that have all the cameras and stuff on it, and that would be the 5G and implementing all of the communications, things like that, whatever, to manage the city. Smart regions, they called it. It used to be, before this, that every city had to figure out their smart policy by themselves, right? So Scottsdale had its own challenges, and if Verizon came in and said, we want to do this here, and whatever, they had to go to the Scottsdale City Council and say, plead their case, and if they said, get out, then it's done, right? They get out. The smart region concept is based on regionalism, which is not an American thought at all. We are not supposed to have anything to do with regionalism in America. That's more of a Soviet type of a concept. But Crow and his cronies got the idea, we could create policies for the whole region. So in Phoenix we have, I forget how many, 22 cities or something, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 22 cities, and there's 4.5 million people, and the county, in any case, the county actually contains most of that, but they're also looking at some of the other cities like Casa Grande, Rapid, and this whole thing too. They want to create smart city policies for the whole region and take it to the region. And say, here's what we're going to do, guys. Everybody's going to do this. So they come to Scottsdale, they come to Phoenix, to Glendale, and whatever, all these other places, and say, we've got this figured out. We've got a smart region policy set out, and you're all going to do it, and you're all going to like it. And most of the cities still don't have any idea what this is rolling out, because ASU is still a little bit in the incubation phase of this whole program. It hasn't gotten teeth in it yet. But they recently merged their efforts with the Maricopa Association of Governments, which is a regional body that has teeth and that has representatives from all the cities and the area counties as well. And the Maricopa Association of Governments is now come alongside of this whole smart city, the smart region concept, to take these policies and implement them throughout the region in spite of what the city councils have to say.
That was not, was it because of money, are they getting money? Is that why they want to do it, or is it power and money? But like, are they being rewarded by, are they being paid by the government to do these things?
Big time.
So that's
Industry, let me express the following and you'll understand it immediately. Let's say you are a compliance and you want to implement, I'm just using this as an example, there's others, but say you want to implement 5G towers and in this whole area, and you've got your trucks all ready to go, your installers ready to go out and do it, but you have to go down to Scottsdale City Council, and then you gotta go to Phoenix City Council, and then you gotta go to Glendale and Guadalupe, and, you know, Surprise, and all these places. There's a bunch of rednecks out there that, you know, that blow it away, you know, we don't like what you're doing. And so they have to go through this whole exercise for every city. We've got 22 cities in our area. And they have to go and present to each one and try and wheedle their way through to get whatever it is they want to do done in that community. Well, I'll tell you what, that's an expensive, if not maybe even an impossible task to do. To get any kind of uniform policy across the whole area, which would be good for them. So when they get into this, to promoting the smart region concept, just imagine the benefits that comes out for them, because they get the input on what the policy should be for the whole area. And if they can successfully get it kind of snuck in and snuck down into all these cities at the same time, bam, they got their big project going, and there's no more contesting from the city councils because they've been co-opted by the regional plan. You follow what I'm saying? So this is a windfall to them. This is why they are backing it, the smart region concept. And all of these big companies, if you go look at the corporate people who are involved with this, you'll see the Verizons, the T-Mobiles, you'll see Cisco, for instance, the big switch, you know, router company. You'll see Accenture, all these big, giant technology companies. They're the ones that are pushing this because they can get rid of the pesky little city councils.
How do we stop them? How do we stop them?
I know.
Well, the problem too is that the suburbans are being attacked at a federal level too. I mean, you can see what the liberal policies, if they don't want suburban areas, they want Phoenix to control everybody. They want a single city in every state, basically.
Yeah. This leads me probably to the most important thing I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I have been, all my career, I have been an educator, a teacher, a lecturer, researcher, of course, that's what I teach about. And I'm more pleased to do that than anything in the whole world. If I could just do that and be left alone, I'd probably be a happy camper. But at this point, Americans at large have way too much information in their brain and no incentive to actually do anything with what they have. In other words, there's a point at which education becomes enough, and getting education for the sake of education is like the PhD student who stays around for his 4th, 5th, and 6th PhD at the same university, right? A professional student. America's full of professional students, if you will. People who have attended Tea Party meetings and other types of, meetings of local, quote-unquote, patriots and communities. And they get educated on what what's going on. But when it comes down to engaging in doing something to push back, they're impotent. They either don't have the energy, or they don't have the knowledge, or something. They just don't have the will to stand up and do anything about it. This is what led me, and I can pull out the next prop. This is what led me in 2018 to create Citizens for Free Speech. And I've got enough of these flyers for brochures for all of you. Citizens for Free Speech. And I'll tell you why I did it. It was based on my studies on technocracy. I realized in 2018 that there was collusion going on between Twitter and Facebook, at least, and Google, to cancel out people from the narrative and the internet. And it was obvious to me, previous to that, mostly you see people disappearing off of Twitter or disappearing off of Facebook. But all of a sudden, there was a coordinated effort where somebody would be nixed from all of these platforms at the same time. That speaks of collusion to me. Somebody's communicating somewhere. We're going to get that guy. Let's take him down. A good example of that, I think, probably is maybe Dr. Joseph Mercola. Some of you know who Mercola is. He's one of the largest alternative medicine doctors on the internet. Millions of people come to his website every month. Google completely scrubbed him from search engines. He lost 95% of his traffic in the next month to his website. They've since kicked him off of Twitter, and they've kicked him off of Facebook, and every whole bunch of other stuff as well. He's still going strong, but he's the case in point. When I saw this colluding type of censorship going on, I was alarmed to the point where I knew that we were in the biggest trouble we've ever been in our history, in the history of our country, because the First Amendment was being destroyed by these people. So I started Citizens for Free Speech to defend and support the First Amendment. And now since COVID, all of a sudden, this has become more relevant than you could ever imagine. Because the whole great pandemic, and remember where it came from, Imperial College of London, this great pandemic has had a direct attack on every facet of the First Amendment, and there's 5. Freedom of expression of religion is number 1. You probably have heard, in California at least, perhaps, of people like Pastor John MacArthur, who's been in battle with the state over keeping his church open. They want him shut. He's got thousands of people in his congregation. They want it shut. And he said, we're not shutting. We're here to serve the people. We are essential in the world, and we're here to serve our people who come. And so they've been trying every which way they can to shut MacArthur down. This has happened in many other churches around the country as well, where churches are being so persecuted by local and state authorities, they're driving them out of business. If you think retail is being driven out of business, you need to look at churches too. Because once a church is cut off at the knees, if they lose half the people coming to church, they lose their financial base, it's gone. And those people don't just come back once they're in the habit of going, not going. And all of a sudden, you've got a wave of churches going bankrupt, or whatever you call it for a church across the country. Then you got the issue of free speech. How can you have free speech when you're Muslim? Just think about this. How can you have free speech when you're Muslim? You can't. And yet, the whole country has been talked into some type of voluntary muzzling in some cases. Sometimes there's mandates, and everybody's wearing a muzzle. And they don't understand that they've been hoodwinked into this pattern of suppressing free speech. Well, what about the right to assemble?
Well, the government
We're
is
assembling
shut
here.
down, right? I mean, they're not taking public comment right now.
That's right.
The governments basically won't come back. They're in hiding. So where are we being heard?
You're right.
Who's listening?
You're right. Nobody's listening to us. That gets to the 5th point of the First Amendment. The right to assemble right now is pretty much a joke, because if you have to stay 6 feet apart, or if you have to wear a mask, whatever, you have no assembly, you just have a train wreck. And I encourage people, figure 1,000 people are going to come together and they're all going to social distance, put the dots out on a piece of paper and figure out what the whole block looks like if 1,000 people are standing 6 feet apart. And you say, well, that's no meeting, that's no protest or nothing. Then you have the right to redress for grievances to the government. The government's not listening to us anymore. They're just not listening. People have protested to Ducey, and around the country, I might say, people have protested to the government. They've been intelligent people, not just waving, rotten eggs or whatever. But the government has not been listening to them. In Michigan, this is an amazing story. In Michigan, where Gretchen Whitmer, the witch of the East, had the most draconian mandates in the country. She was just hated by the people in her own state. She would not relent for nothing. She didn't listen to anybody, and she just, every time somebody complained, she just put the screws down even harder. The Michigan Supreme Court this last week, you can all say amen to this one, the Michigan Supreme Court struck down her emergency order, whack, like that. And they just closed her down. They said, you have no right to declare these mandates, these health-related mandates in Michigan, and they ruled them null and void. Isn't that great? Yes. Here's the case where the government would not listen to the people. They flat out wouldn't listen, and they got a lucky home run with the Supreme Court. Somebody took it that way through the legal system. And they finally got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck it down. This just proves the point that what is happening today is just flat out unconstitutional. It just spits on the Constitution. and is designed to destroy it, because all 5 elements of the First Amendment are under attack at the same time. Can that be accident? Can that be just coincidental? That all 5 are under attack at the same time? I don't think so. And here's what really worries me and concerns me the most. And I'll say this with an under accent. The framers put the First Amendment first for a reason. It was because it's all based on communication. They knew that communication was the foundation and the watershed of our constitutional republic. They communicated extensively when they wrote the documents in the first place. They didn't all agree, but they communicated. They put the First Amendment first because they said, this is what you need to do all these other things, all these other amendments. Communicate. It has to stay in place. They put the Second Amendment in the second position on purpose. And I've talked to constitutional attorneys on this, and they've confirmed this through the other writings and stuff around that day. The Second Amendment was placed second because if the First Amendment fails, the fallback position is the Second Amendment. And you know what that means. I don't even want to go there. We don't want to beat the Second Amendment. I don't, maybe you do. I don't. I don't think Americans, that just break my heart, I don't ever want to see Americans killing other Americans. For any reason. It's wrong. It's just so wrong. This is our country. Well, if the First Amendment does not survive, we're done. We have no more ability to communicate. And you realize when, in all the Marxists, every single Marxist takeover in the world, whether it be Mozambique or what used to be Rhodesia, or whether it be even the Soviet Union, what happens is they take over the state media, they take over the newspapers, and anybody that still has a protest after that, they shoot or kill, or just send them off into oblivion. But they go after the ability of the people to communicate their message to other citizens of the country, right? This is what is at risk right now with the First Amendment in today's society. These technocrats, this isn't lost on them. These technocrats that launched this from the University of London, this was the crowd, same global warming crowd. And by the way, global warming failed for one simple reason: it could never produce a body. Nobody died in global warming. Nobody died. Maybe polar bears. And they didn't die. They said they died. The polar bears didn't die either. But they couldn't produce any bodies to really get people scared. Enter the pandemic. Oh, now there's some dead bodies laying around. Now they can really scare them, right? And they have. And people are scared to death that are still wearing masks, are scared to death they're going to get sick and die because they think it's a death sentence to get this virus. And it's not. We all pretty much know that now. It's not a death sentence. It probably isn't much worse than the flu. Yeah. But nevertheless, that's the mantra that's produced. So when the COVID thing hit, it put Citizens for Free Speech into an interesting battle. It was just something that happened. I didn't go after it like, wow, we're going to do this when it hits. I wasn't part of that 201 event, whatever it was, back in 2019 when we talked about the pandemic. They didn't invite me. They said, get ready with CFFS, you're going to have a big play here. But since the COVID thing came along, Americans started crying out, knowing that there was a rat in the woodshed. Yes. That what's wrong here? What's going on? And all of a sudden, our activities around the country just absolutely exploded. And we started by creating this little face mask, no face mask card. This is kind of a silly little card in a way, but it says wearing a face mask poses a serious health risk to me. And on the back it has the First Amendment. And it becomes kind of a prop so people can explain if you get resistance that, there's something called the First Amendment. Here it is right here. But it says under the HIPAA Act, I'm not required to disclose my medical conditions to you, and that's absolutely true. And that I'm exempt from any local or state regulation mandating face mask usage in public. And I want to say that Governor Ducey's executive orders underscore this, that for those that are unable to, whatever their belief is, are unable to wear a face mask, that they're exempt from wearing a face mask. It's in the executive order. This is not a myth. This is what the executive order says. Now, people have taken that to the extreme where they say, oh, nobody is wearing a face mask. You can't come in here without wearing a face mask. Well, okay. Some people have taken it to extreme. But we teamed up with a doctor who happened to be a friend of mine by the name of Dr. Russell Blaylock. Some of you may have run across him somewhere in health circles, but he's retired now. He's a board-certified neurosurgeon, had a great career. He writes a health newsletter now. It's widely circulated. And Dr. Blaylock was upset about this whole mask thing from day one because he said this is a pandemic waiting to happen itself. Healthy people wearing face masks. So he wrote this brochure for us, or the text in it, face mask pose serious risk to the healthy. And if you can imagine that there is something wrong with the healthy wearing these things, you can imagine what happens to the sick. What about people with emphysema, COPD, with cancer, with added diabetes? There's all kinds of conditions that people have, and especially when they're over 50, that any doctor would say, don't ever restrict your airway. Just don't do it. It's crazy, So about half our population right now is just kind of wiped out by this whole thing. They have to wear the face mask at their own risk. And some of them are going to suffer some very serious, and already have actually suffered some very serious health consequences. But he wrote this from the aspect, which is what about the healthy people that are around? If you think you're healthy, what about them? And he says, this is a recipe for disaster. And I won't read the article to you, but we've been also distributing these brochures now around the country by the tens of thousands, and our cards as well to people in every state in the union now. And people are using this as a protest, basically to say, I will not comply. That's just bottom line. I will not comply, and here's why. Number one, it's a health issue because you cannot force me to do something that's detrimental to my own health. Doesn't that make sense? I mean, does anybody think otherwise? I mean, that you somehow have the right to tell me what to do if it's going to harm me? I don't think so. What about the Declaration of Independence, that we have unalienable rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness? Oh, I want to be happy. Shoot me some more or whatever. Well, this is the battle of the century for us in America right now, is to tell these technocrats that we're not going to play their silly games. That has to be the message in the end, and only American citizens can do this. The federal government is not going to save us. The state government's not going to save us. Ducey's not going to save us.
No.
The city councils by themselves cannot save us necessarily. It has to be the people of the country, individually and severally, that stand up on this. This is probably truly the most people-centric issue that's ever in our country. Yes, sir?
One last thing about Citizens for Free Speech is that we're instituting a training program called Citizen Ninja Stand Up to Power. And it has to do with communication training on how to talk to people who may not agree with you and how to get your persuasion across to them to get them to move towards you. And that could be family members, it could be politicians, it could be people on the street. We see them all the time. Nobody, so far to our knowledge, has been offering this type of training where you can learn how to effectively communicate with people at all levels of society. And like I said, a lot of people tell us that I can't even talk to my kids anymore, or my sister, or my brother. They won't listen to me. They hate me now.
It's dividing families.
Yeah, I know. So anyway, we're overcoming that. If you follow along with CFFS, there's some brochures here. You can take one. Get on board if you're interested in our training too. It's going to be coming soon.